Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the Commissioner's Office podcast. My name is Daniel, and I'm going to start off with a question for our listeners. Where were you in the year 2010? For some of our listeners, it could be you were a child, maybe in preschool or kindergarten. For others, it could be they were in a similar place as they are now. But that is definitely not the case for the 2010 San Diego Chargers, as in the 2010 NFL season, this Chargers team was possibly the best team ever to not make the playoffs, and I'm going to tell you all about it. So, this Chargers team in 2010, they were still led by Philip Rivers, their star quarterback since about 2004, who, for some of our maybe younger viewers or listeners, he's on the Colts now. They know him as a Colts player, but he was on the Chargers for about 15 years, and he was very good. He might be one of the best quarterbacks ever to not only win a Super Bowl, but not get to a Super Bowl. They also had some good supporting receivers for Philip Rivers, like Antonio Gates, their star tight end. They had Vincent Jackson, among others. And they also had a rookie running back named Ryan Matthews, who a lot of people don't really remember, but he was pretty good for a few years. And they also had Mike Tolbert, who was a very huge meme at the time. So I'm going to tell you the story of the 2010 San Diego Chargers and how this might be one of the most painful teams ever assembled. So I got this idea from the YouTube channel Secret Base. They made a video about this team, and it goes way more in depth than what I'm about to tell you. So check out that video if you're interested. So before the season, Antonio Gates, Vincent Jackson, Malcolm Floyd were all hurt during the season. Those are Philip Rivers' best targets probably. But Philip Rivers still led them to the second best passing attack in the NFL, which, a lot of people, I think, have a negative opinion of Philip Rivers because, I've said this before, he throws more interceptions than he has children. But, he really is a great player, and he's definitely a Hall of Famer. They also had a really good run game with the aforementioned Ryan Matthews and Mike Tolbert. They had a pretty good speed guy with Ryan Matthews, and Mike Tolbert was kind of like the power fullback. Also, they were coming off of not having LaDainian Tomlinson anymore, who was probably the best running back of his generation. And, they needed some help in the running game, and they got some good runners. On the defensive side, their defensive coordinator was a second-year coordinator at the time, Ron Rivera, who is the current head coach of the Washington football team and is also battling cancer. So, here's hoping that he just, beats the crap out of cancer. But this defense was not a joke either. They actually allowed the fewest passing yards and the fourth fewest rushing yards in the NFL that season. And their offense gained almost 2,000 more yards than their defense allowed. So, it's like a yardage differential kind of thing, so that their defense allowed such a small amount of yards, and then their offense was so good that they had the biggest differential. It's crazy. So you're probably wondering, if this team was so good, then how did they not make the playoffs? Well, I'm about to tell you. So their week 1 matchup is at the Kansas City Chiefs. In the first half, they allowed 2 lengthy punt returns. Their special teams was not exactly something that you would think of as kind of costing you a game, but here's where it really gets weird. They allowed a punt return touchdown from Dexter McCluster of the Kansas City Chiefs, and they lost 21-14. So that touchdown was the game winner. So, it's just one game. It's not that big of a deal. In week 2, they took down the Jaguars 38-13. So at this point, they're 1-1. Not sweating the mistakes too much. But here we go. Week 3, they're at Seattle. Even though they almost doubled Seattle's offensive output, the special teams unit just still cost them the game, essentially. They allowed one kick return touchdown from Leon Washington, who I believe was a Pro Bowler at least once throughout his career, but they were able to rally back to tie the game at 20. But late in the game, they allowed another kick return touchdown to Leon Washington. Another. This team allowed 2 kick return touchdowns in one game. I don't think as a fan I've ever seen that before. This was before I started watching football, so I don't remember this, and I don't think I've ever seen it before. I've seen people come close, but 2 kick return touchdowns in the game? No way. I've never seen that before. They ended up losing that game, 27-20. They were able to beat the Cardinals 41-10 in the next game, but then week 5 at the Raiders, who were still in Oakland, they were not in Vegas, they dominated on both sides of the ball. Their defense was really good and their offense was as good as advertised, but they dug themselves into a hole. They were down 12 points because of 2 blocked punts. One resulted in a safety and the other resulted in a touchdown. And they lost 35-27. They lost by a touchdown again. All 3 of their losses so far in the season through week 5 have been 7-point losses. I mean, being a Chargers fan is hard enough. You know, your owner, Dean Spanos, is a greedy slimeball who does not care about, the city of San Diego. He moved them out of San Diego to Los Angeles, even though they had a really loyal fan base and the team wasn't really doing too bad at that point. But, if you're a Chargers fan in 2010, you don't have LaDainian Tomlinson anymore, and you've lost 3 games on 1 single touchdown. I mean, I can't imagine that, as a Bears fan, we've had some tough losses before, but this is not the way to open up a season for a team that has Super Bowl aspirations. Another crazy thing about this game, though, across the 2010 season, there were 12 blocked punts the entire season, through all games, all teams. The Chargers suffered 4. They had 4 blocked punts. So, for those of you who aren't, math wizards like I am, they accounted for 33% of all blocked punts, 1/3, which is insane. So these blocked punts also, they happened on back-to-back drives. And the odds of this happening are 42,000 to 1. It's just, I mean, that's crazy. I've never seen this before. When I watched this video from Secret Base myself, I was just like, I just couldn't believe it because this was just so crazy. But let's move on now to week 6. They're playing the St. Louis Rams in St. Louis before they move to Los Angeles as well. So in the first quarter, the Chargers allow a 42-yard punt return to Danny Amendola, who a lot of you might think of as Dolphins, Lions, and mainly Patriots wide receiver, but early in his career, he was a return specialist for the Rams. So they allow a 42-yard punt return to Danny Amendola, and that set up a chip shot field goal. But, it was just the first quarter. It's not anything to panic about, right? Well, you're wrong, because in the fourth quarter, the Chargers kicker Nate Kading slipped on a field goal attempt and got blocked. And the Chargers lost 20-17. They lost by a field goal. So it's not looking good. Week 7 versus the Patriots, in the second quarter, they allowed a 34-yard punt return. I think this is before halftime, leading to a chip shot field goal because, the Patriots quarterback was this guy named Tom Brady, who I don't think many people have heard of, but, he's really good. The Chargers lost that game 23-20. Another crushing loss on 1 field goal that could have been easily prevented if they just locked down. But, it's not all bad because the Chargers actually won 7 of their next 9 games. But unfortunately, even though they won 7 of 9, which is really hard to do, it was still too little too late. The Chiefs took the Chargers' playoff spot. They essentially won the Chiefs won the AFC West instead of the Chargers. But before this happened, before any of this was decided, they met in week 14. So the Chiefs' starting quarterback was Matt Castle at the time. They didn't have Patrick Mahomes. But Matt Castle was out. He had to get an appendectomy. So they had to start a guy named Brodie Croyle. I know, I've never heard of him either. Brodie Croyle was, let's just say, he was not very good. The Chargers won 31-0. That was the largest shutout in the league that entire season. So the Chargers held the Chiefs to no points, less than 100 yards on offense. Less than 100 yards on offense. Do you understand? Like, I don't know, for some of our viewers who may not be as big of a football nerd as I am, for some of our viewers, they might not understand that, but that is ridiculous because you can essentially get 100 yards of offense on one play. And the Chargers just allowed less than 100 yards of total offense through the entire game. And they also did this with no turnovers. Chiefs didn't commit one turnover the entire game, which this has only happened 5 times since 1940. When the stat started being tracked in 1940, I mean, that was during an era of football where it was mostly defense-oriented. Like, they're very low-scoring games, mostly just like field goals, touchdowns, under 20 points of offense from each team. The fact that this game is rivaling other games that took place in an era where scoring barely happened is, to me, that's just crazy. Through the 2010 season, the Chargers had a nearly 2,000 point differential. So I think that would be about, I think I mentioned this before with yardage, how their defense allowed such few yards, but their offense gained so many yards. But this is not yardage, this is points. Their defense allowed so few points, but their offense was just so high scoring. I mean, that's nearly 2,000 yard point differential. That ranks 3rd best all time. And the other 2 teams that had a better point differential than this Chargers team in 2010 both won the Super Bowl. So the other 2 teams are the 1979 Steelers, I believe, which they were led by Terry Bradshaw, and they had the steel curtain, that crushing defense that just did not allow an inch. And the other team was the 2001 Rams, the greatest show on turf. That Rams team, for, again, some of our viewers who aren't as nerdy as I am, that team had Kurt Warner, Marshall Faulk, Torrey Holt, Isaac Bruce. That team is regarded as one of the best offenses in league history. So the Chargers are in very good company, but yet they didn't make the playoffs. And this is probably the reason why. I think you're probably starting to see a pattern take place why this team wasn't very good. It wasn't because of their offense. No, they had Phillip Rivers, they had Vincent Jackson, they had Antonio Gates. It wasn't because of their defense. No, they had the best defense in the league. It was because of their special teams, which, I've seen special teams cost teams games all the time. Obviously missed field goals, but just the way that they lost all of these games, to me, is just, it's crazy because they were all on just punt returns that easily could have been stopped. Granted, these are some good returners. Danny Amendola is a good returner. Dexter McCluster, for a very small amount of time, was a very dangerous returner. But, it's crazy to me how they just lost like 5 games on these really, really easy to stop punt returns. But, it cost them. It just cost them. This is another thing about their special teams. The Chargers allowed nearly 19 yards per punt return. 19 yards. That may not really seem like a lot, but to put that in perspective, that's the most any team has allowed in a season since 1970. So this Chargers special teams unit wasn't just bad, it was historically bad. It ranks among some of the worst all time. It kind of seems like now in hindsight that it really could have been prevented, or at least it might have been a little bit better if they just re-signed one player. I know what you're thinking, Daniel, one player makes a special teams unit so much better. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that maybe if they re-signed someone who, I don't know, made the Pro Bowl as a special teams player 3 out of the last 4 years, maybe their special teams unit wouldn't be so horrendous that it would, get them into the playoffs when they pretty much had it. But the Chargers didn't. So I'm obviously talking about Kasim Osgood, who even I don't know who he is. He was their special teams leader and captain for a while back before this season. As I mentioned before, he made the Pro Bowl 3 out of the last 4 years as a special teams player before the 2010 season. Now, I don't know exactly what role this guy played, but, special teams is a very, how do you describe it, I guess? Special teams is a very, in theory, it seems very simple. You just run and you tackle the returner. But it's actually it's coached very heavily, and it takes a lot to get it right on the return side and the kicking side. But nonetheless, this guy was the captain of the team, and he was their special teams leader, and he made the Pro Bowl a bunch of times. And so he left. He didn't re-sign with the team. And the team was terrible without it, and it cost them what potentially could have been a Super Bowl winning team. Now, with all of this, you're thinking probably, who was coaching this team? Well, their special teams coach was a guy named Steve Crosby, who at that time had been coaching since the late 70s. So this guy was a 30-year coaching veteran. By no means he was a bad coach. He was not a bad coach. He was a very competent coach, and he supposedly was the right man for the job. But something just didn't click, and this special teams unit just didn't get it done. And that's why the Chargers, even though they had the best offense and the best defense, they didn't make the playoffs, which, it couldn't happen to a more unlucky player, in Philip Rivers. Philip Rivers, he gets a lot of shade because, he throws a lot of interceptions, and he has 9 children, which is kind of funny. But if you actually look at the numbers, this guy is an incredible player. For a guy who had such terrible management, he never really had a good head coach. He had some good teams, but he really never got help on the offensive line. This guy was so brutally treated by the San Diego management. He had LaDainian Tomlinson for a while. He had Vincent Jackson. Towards the end of his tenure, he had Keenan Allen. But another thing about Philip Rivers, though, he was just so resilient, I'm pretty sure this guy once played an AFC championship on a torn ACL, which, if you're not a doctor like I obviously am, that can put you out for the season if it's suffered in week 1. A torn ACL is one of the worst injuries a football player can suffer. This guy played an entire half on a torn ACL one time. He's such a dedicated player, and he goes so hard every time he plays. And it's just really sad that this guy could never even go to a Super Bowl. It's him or Dan Marino are the best quarterbacks of all time to never win a Super Bowl. But here's the thing. Dan Marino went to a Super Bowl. He got blown out by the 49ers, but he at least went to the Super Bowl. And, to make things even worse for Philip Rivers, the previous season, he led his team to a 13-3 record. 13-3. And they got to the divisional round, but they lost. You want to know how much they lost by? I'll give you a hint. It's 1 score. Their kicker, Nate Kading, missed 3 field goals in that game. 3 field goals. If you miss 3 field goals in the game now, you're essentially fired you're released the next day. It's just unacceptable. The life of a kicker in the NFL is essentially you just go on a hot streak for as long as possible, and then eventually you just miss 3 field goals, and then you're just done. So Nate Kading, even though he was still on the team next year, and I'm not sure how good he was, but he missed 3 field goals. 2 of them were very makeable inside 50 yards in that game, and they lost 17-14 to the Jets. The Jets of all teams. The Jets led by Mark Sanchez. It's such an unfortunate thing to happen to teams. And this This story it just baffled me because I've never seen this before. A lot of the times when you think of a Super Bowl caliber team, you think of like a team like the 2013 Broncos with Peyton Manning and his 55 touchdown record-setting season. That offense was probably the best. That offense was the best I've ever seen. It was amazing how efficient it was and just how powerful it was. And the defense, it wasn't fantastic, but it was pretty good. They had Von Miller, they had TJ Ward, Chris Harris. I mean, that was a good defense, but it wasn't the best in the league. A lot of these Super Bowl teams, it's either one or the other. Really good offense, really bad defense, and then vice versa. But this Chargers team had the best offense and the best defense, and yet they couldn't even make playoffs. So I think that's going to wrap it up here for the first episode of the Commissioner's Office podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out our pages on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and I will see you all next time.